In this module, we're going to take a look at Europe from the 6th to the 19th centuries. We're going to also be looking at European and African relations during this period, and most importantly, the development of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. The objectives of this module are, first of all, that you should be able to list 4 characteristics of life in medieval Europe during the Middle Ages. Second, that you should be able to describe the Crusades, the impact of the Crusades on life in Europe. Third, that you should be able to list 4 characteristics of life in Renaissance Europe, which follows the Middle Ages period. Fourth, that you should be able to suggest ways in which European life changed as a result of exploration and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere. And finally, that you should be able to suggest ways in which African life also changed as a result of exploration and exploitation of the Western Hemisphere. One of the things that we're going to focus on as we look at African American history in this early period is the interaction between Europe, Africa, and the peoples and cultures of Native America. We've looked at Africa, West Africa in particular, from about the 6th to the 16th centuries. So now we're going to turn our attention to Europe during the same time. Europe during this early period, from the 6th to the 11th centuries, is Europe of the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. The bookends for this period are the fall of the Roman Empire about the 6th century AD, and the Crusades about the 11th century AD. The 4 characteristics of the Middle Ages are, first of all, feudalism and decentralization of authority. Second, restrictions on learning. Third, society that is dominated by religion. And fourth, that there's very little support for or interest in exploration during this period. People are really concerned with very insular, isolated lives that they lead in small villages and hamlets in parts of Europe, throughout Europe. Then in the 11th century, you had the beginning of the Crusades. The goal of the Crusades was an attempt to, the Crusades themselves, all of these Crusades, were attempts to reclaim the Holy Lands from the Muslims. During this period, feudal monarchs, church leaders, nobles, organized armies of serfs, men, women, and children, to go into the Muslim kingdoms of the Holy Lands and to try to reclaim these areas. As a result of these crusades, you saw some major changes take place in Europe. First of all, people who went on the crusades came in contact with new cultures, they saw new environments, they saw new ways of life. Even though they were going to the areas primarily for war, for battle, they were taken away from the lives that they were leading in Europe, and they were brought into contact with peoples and lifestyles that were very different from their own. Second, the Crusades stimulated demands for products that they found in the East, in the Middle East, or in the Orient. Things that were not products that were not common to their own ways of life. Third, the Crusades saw the beginning of interest in sugar cultivation. Sugar was one of the items, one of the spices, or one of the new products that they came into contact with while they were in the Middle East. And they began to develop an interest in sugar cultivation on plantations using a combination of free and slave labor, or all slave labor, all enslaved labor forces. In Palestine, European crusaders used this combination of labor sources, But after they were driven out of that region, they retreated to the Mediterranean islands of Cyprus, Malta, Crete, and Rhodes, where they produced sugarcane and grapes using slave labor. The first slaves, however, were not African slaves. They were not black slaves. They were actually Muslims or pagan Slavs from the Black Sea area or the Adriatic, and possibly a few black Africans. But even the term slave comes from the word Slav, Slavic peoples, S-L-A-V, coming from this Black Sea area. You begin to see the creation of economies, of the economic components of overseas expansion as another impact of the Crusades. Colonies, in this case, colonies on the islands, Mediterranean islands, producing staple crops, in this case, the crop was sugar, and using slave or non-free labor. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, Europe underwent a renaissance as a whole. This is still during the latter part of the Crusade period, but life is changing in Europe. The whole philosophy of ways of thinking and ways of governing and ways of economic development are changing. Renaissance as a term applies to this period when European culture undergoes this rebirth of an interest in learning. And that is probably one of the most important things that happens during the Renaissance period. Again, a rebirth of an interest in learning. And with this rebirth of an interest in learning and knowing, a rebirth of an interest in exploring, finding out new things, coming in contact with new peoples. You also begin to see, during this period, the rise of very powerful monarchs and strong nation states. For example, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I in England, Philip II and Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. Begin to see challenges to the authority of the Catholic Church and the popes. For example, if you think about it, when Henry VIII decides that because he would like to have a male heir, and that his first wife, Catherine, had not produced this heir, had only daughters and sons who had died in early childhood or at childbirth, he decides that he will put aside his wife, divorce his wife, and marry Anne Boleyn. Now, of course, that meant that he has to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church and to challenge the popes at that time. You had the promotion of voyages of exploration during this period. If you think back to your Western civilization courses or your world civilization courses, this is a period when Prince Henry of Portugal provides a royal sanction, a royal support for voyages of exploration that will take sailors around the coast of Africa looking for a way to the Orient, to China, to whatever, to those sources of spices that were becoming very important in European trade. And then the result of this is, from the 1430s to the 1490s, a kind of geographic revolution as explorers from Spain and Portugal began to remap the world with their discoveries for Europe, of passageways around the African continent and across the Atlantic to the Americas. This is the period of Diaz and da Gama exploring for the Portuguese around the coast of Africa. This is a period of Columbus exploring for the Spanish, traveling to across the Atlantic Ocean and bringing Europe into contact with the civilizations of the Western Hemisphere. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, European nations and peoples explore, and this is a period of exploration and conquest of the Western Hemisphere. European nations and peoples are responding to these developments from the Renaissance period, this desire to learn, this desire to explore by going out and finding things, finding new places. And as they find these, of course, they establish colonies. They begin to plant colonies. in North, Central, South America, and the Caribbean. They have to exploit these colonies, these areas, to make them prosperous. The Native American cultures that they come into contact with do not prove to be sufficient as a labor supply to help with this exploitation. So you begin to see the establishment of New World African slavery as a labor source and as a way of helping to develop European development of the Western Hemisphere. More importantly, as a way of bringing this African labor supply to the New World, you have the development of the transatlantic slave trade. And that is an area, this new trading pattern is an area that will in many ways put Europe into a new relationship with Africa, with the nations of West Africa. European exploration changes. European exploration of the coast of Africa, European exploration of the New World changes African trade patterns and trade relationships. In the 16th century, African kingdoms and empires were involved in long-distance trade and commerce as a part of the East African or Trans-Saharan desert trade. East African states traded with Asia and the Middle East, with Turkey, Greece, Persia, India, and China, exchanging gold and slaves for silks and spices. North African states traded with Portugal, Spain, France, the Italian city-states, Persia, Turkey, and Greece, exchanging gold, dates, and salt and slaves for salt and other spices and products. And West African states traded with Portugal, Spain, and the Americas, the Caribbean, North America, South America. During this period, exchanging gold and slaves for salt, and after 1492, for guns, for rum, and for other manufactured goods. Trade patterns shifted dramatically in the 15th and 16th centuries. Although Africans continued to interact with rulers, traders, and commodities, to exchange these commodities with merchants from the north, the east, and the south, new trading opportunities developed with merchants and explorers from Europe. So the old trading patterns continue to some extent, but these new trading relationships, these new trading patterns start to emerge. The first contacts between Europeans and large numbers of African peoples from the along the West African coast began between 1444 and 1455. By the end of the 1440s, Europeans were regular traders in the region of the Senegal River, and by 1460, they were trading for gold in Sierra Leone. They reached the Gold Coast in 1471 and Benin a few years later. Some African rulers organized military and naval defenses, and the Portuguese, the earliest of these explorers, met very stiff resistance in some places. The Portuguese decided that peace was more profitable on those occasions, and they often invited African rulers or members of families of African rulers and other influentials to visit Portugal. Portuguese explorers also seized or kidnapped African people, taking them back to Portugal as slaves. A few African rulers converted to Christianity, and some of them even sent family or subjects to study in Portuguese universities. From 1650 to 1750, you began to see the emergence of what we will call the transatlantic trade. It starts as early as the 1500s. It becomes more prosperous as the Western Hemisphere nations, colonies began to develop. This transatlantic trade ties Africa to the New World and to European economic systems. Africa provided the labor that would be used to exploit European colonies in the Americas. These colonies also then in turn supplied raw materials for Europe's factories, which produced manufactured goods for the new global marketplace. If you look at the map that you at this point, you'll see that there is a very significant trading relationship that has emerged between Africa, the West Indies, the North American colonies, that is supplying slaves, and that ties Africa in with this very significant trade pattern that becomes known as the transatlantic trade. And notice the flow of raw materials from the Western Hemisphere back to Europe, and the flow of manufactured goods from Europe to the Western Hemisphere. So Africa is tied very, very closely, West Africa is tied very closely into these new trading patterns. European merchants built trading posts along the African coast, posts like Elmina, that is pictured in like Elmina, that's pictured in this photograph. Elmina was located on the west coast in what is now the nation of Ghana. European nations and merchants also created self-governing trading towns. Portugal set up colonies on uninhabited offshore islands along the coast of Africa, islands like Cape Verde, Sao Tome, and Principe. They established and controlled one mainland colony, the colony of Angola. And in other areas where they did not establish this control or this permanent colony, they negotiated power relationships with African rulers. There was little difference between Europe and Africa in the 16th century or the 1500s. And thriving trade relations emerged between Europeans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, and other states, and Africans during this period. African states produced textiles, gold, and other commodities, and European imports, or manufactured goods, trade goods, supplemented products in African marketplaces. European trade complemented African production, especially where there was not enough native production to satisfy internal markets, where Africans themselves were not producing enough of a product, let's say textiles, for example, to satisfy the demands of the people of these regions. Then European products very often supplemented but did not replace the African products. For example, cotton and linen were not produced locally in Africa. The threads were very often imported textiles brought into Africa that were used to manufacture a kind of hybrid fabric in Africa, which was then re-exported to Europe and the West Indies. So you have threads that are brought in from Europe, maybe even cloth that is brought in, and then in a sense disassembled by Africans, and then rewoven into a different kind of fabric that is then exported from Africa to Europe and the West Indies. The European demand for sugar led to the development of a plantation-style economy on the Madeira Islands off the northwest coast of Africa. The three components of the plantation system, which would be replicated in the New World, were present in this location. You had, in these components, or these three components, you had the cash crop, sugar, you had the cheap labor, it could be Muslims, Slavic peoples, sometimes Africans. This is what we mentioned earlier in terms of this new plantation system that had started to emerge in the Renaissance period. And then finally, you had abundant land and adequate climate. Now, what is significant about this is that when this system is replicated in the Western Hemisphere, these same three components are necessary. The cash crop may change. It may be sugar in the West Indies. It may be tobacco in North America. It may eventually be some other products. But a cash crop is essential. Corn is not a cash crop in that way. Corn is more a subsistence crop. Cheap labor. You have to have cheap labor for this plantation system. And the locations, in many cases, will dictate what this cheap labor will be. In early attempts to exploit the colonial settlements in North America or in South America, the Caribbean, of course, Native Americans were this cheap labor that would be used. But for any number of reasons that we'll talk about later, Native American labor was not sufficient or was not adequate. And then the abundant land, and of course in the Western Hemisphere, this abundant land and adequate climate will be something that will facilitate the development of a plantation economy. The slave trade had existed. The African slave trade had pre-existed in many cases, in many ways, the emergence of this transatlantic trade that will exist. From 650 to 1500 AD, about 4 million West Africans were transported to other parts of the world. Slaves had been one of the commodities that was traded in West Africa for hundreds of years, but human labor had not been a major trade item. This changed with the European discovery and exploitation of lands in the Americas in the 1400s and 1500s. At the same time, the Portuguese were making their first landing along the West African coast. The Europeans are making their discoveries in the Western Hemisphere. As the Portuguese make these landings along the West African coast and become intricately involved in trade along this coast, you begin to see the creation of Creole populations, mixed race or mixed cultural peoples along in West African trading communities. When trading areas changed hands, Creoles had to negotiate or renegotiate relationships with the new trading partners. Perhaps in the early period, the Creole populations that had developed in and around Elmina or Cape Coast, these populations had negotiated trading relations with the Portuguese. When the trade shifted hands to the Dutch, then those Creole peoples had to renegotiate their relationships with this new group of people, and then with the English, and then with the French, and then with the Danes. If they could not renegotiate successfully with these new trading partners, then they themselves might become the enslaved people. The Creole populations were involved in the slave trade. They were involved in the buying and selling of other Africans for slavery. However, they were Creole populations or Creole peoples, West African Creole peoples, were not generally valued as highly as manual laborers. Their knowledge of the strengths and weaknesses of Europeans very often diminished their values as slaves. They knew Europeans too well, if you want, we could put it that way. Now, in this painting, if you look very closely, you can see some examples of these differences in relationships between those who are enslaved Africans and those who are Creole Africans who may be, to some extent, participants in this trade. For example, the woman in the photograph who is sitting on the right side, the painting, who's sitting on the right side of the painting, is a Creole woman, an African Creole woman. And you can see by her posture, you can see by her relationship to the Europeans in the painting, that her status is very different from that of, let's say, the woman, the other women in this photograph, one of who is being branded. So you have one African woman who is sitting in a position that puts her a little above the others, who is perhaps a participant in the slave trade, and another African woman and many African men who are victims of the slave trade. We will talk about this a little later as we look at how the slave trade emerges and what it involves. This is the end of lecture number 1 for this module.